My father, Elliot Sperling, was born on January 4th, 1951, in the Bronx, New York. Over the course of his 66 years of life, his travels, his encounters, and the many friendships he made and the lives he touched, this city from which he was born, which molded him, stayed at the center of his heart. In the course of 66 years, he lived multiple lifetimes as a taxi driver, a hippie, scholar, mentor, activist, uncle, father, each one more productive and meaningful than the other. Elliot came into this world, the first of three sons, to Edith and Solomon Sperling. He soon became a brother to Stephen and Orrin Sperling. Born to two secular Jewish parents, Elliot never took part in religious customs, but took great pride in the more cultural aspects of Judaism. He came from a family that underscored the importance of education, hard work, modesty, and social responsibility, values that would shape his outlook, schooling, his contributions both scholarly and socially, and the eventual impact he left on those who knew and loved him. He has engraved his spirit so deeply in the lives of so many of us that in a way he is still alive. In his 2014 summer interview by a Han Chinese writer, Elliot talked about himself. In the 50s, America had the Beat Generation. In the 60s, there was the hippie movement. In the 60s and 70s, I was about 17 years old, grew up in New York City, and lived in such an era full of different trends and thought. New York City is an international city. Trends and fashions like these are always there. This is kind of culture of confrontation, counterculture. We create new forms of music. Our minds, even what we wear, all absorb this type of counterculture. In advance of one of my many visits to New York, to his apartment in Queens, I asked my father if he'd heard of the movie Inside Llewyn Davis. He was ecstatic that I knew about the movie, and we decided we had to go. My father reveled in the movie. He couldn't believe how well it had captured this early 1960s counterculture movement. And though the plot was set slightly before he embarked on his own journey, it was clear to see the movie profoundly touched him, made him almost melancholic. Upon his return from Delhi, having encountered for the first time Tibetans in exile, Elliot changed his major to East Asian Studies. Elliot remembered, in the 1970s, Dharamsala was an ideal place for the Indian trip. It had very few tourists, no foreigners around. There were very few Indians in McLeod-Ganj, mostly Tibetans there. Dharamsala was so quiet. There was lots of greenery and trees. There were only 2 hotels at the time in Dharamsala, and most foreigners would stay in Kailash Hotel. Elliot remembered, if I hadn't been to Dharamsala in the 1970s, if I went now, I wouldn't even imagine how ideal and peaceful Dharamsala once was. Thus, when I arrived in Dharamsala, at that time, I was like, wow, this place is awesome. These Tibetans are so nice. Then I realized that I began to have an interest in Tibetan history and the Tibetans. Equipped with knowledge of Chinese, made stronger by an overseas study of the language in Taiwan, Elliot matriculated at Indiana University's Department of Uralic and Altaic Studies, where his career would be shaped and developed for the next 4 decades. The department was already internationally renowned, in part owing to the presence on the faculty of Taxe Rinpoche, the Dalai Lama's eldest brother. Elliot studied modern and classical Tibetan, perfected his knowledge of modern and classical Chinese, and wrote his doctoral dissertation, Early Ming Policy Towards Tibet, in 1983. The dissertation has been widely acknowledged as the most influential study on the subject. Originally the head of Khumbu Monastery in Amdo, Taxe Rinpoche was the oldest brother of Gyalwang Rinpoche, the Dalai Lama. After he went to exile in the U.S., he became a Tibetan Studies professor in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies, Indiana University. Taxe Rinpoche was more than just a teacher to my father. The relationship they shared, in many ways, mirrors that which my father had with many of you, not only as a teacher, but as a mentor, a friend, and confidant. I hold great memories of going to the Tibetan Cultural Center as a child, being doted upon by him and his wife Kunyang, and playing with their seemingly ever-expanding pack of dogs and cats. My father always said the sign of a good person was a love of animals. Along with their wisdom and intellect, they shared a love of animals, well documented for both in the photos they left behind. A genuine product of the public education system, Elliot took his first faculty position also at a public institution, the University of Southern Mississippi. In 1984, shortly after arriving in Hattiesburg, he received the prestigious John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. The MacArthur Fellowship is often referred to as the Genius Grant. My grandmother couldn't pass up an opportunity to remind anyone within earshot and all of her friends of this, as though they'd somehow forgotten since the last time they'd spoken. In her typical New York accent, she'd say, "He's a genius, you know." She and my grandfather grew more and more proud of my father with each day. In 1985, Elliot traveled across Tibet. While in Lhasa, he visited the ruin of Ganden Monastery, which was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. It is exactly like what was described. Now, where over 100 great buildings had once stood, only long lines of jagged ruins remain. We'd heard about Ganden's destruction before, recalled Tenzin Tetong, but no words could ever describe the site. It looked as though it was destroyed 500 years ago, not 12. After a short spell at USM, Elliot returned to IU in 1987 as a faculty member. He would remain at the university a much-loved teacher until December 2015, with occasional visiting professorships elsewhere, including Harvard University from 1992 to 93. In 1994, Elliot moved his family for 1 year to India as a Fulbright Fellow and visiting professor at the University of Delhi. This milestone for him was also one of the most shaping experiences of my life. During this time, we visited Nepal, Tibet, and traveled across India, taking numerous trips to Dharamsala, the place that shaped his adulthood, his pursuits, and the very reason why so many of you are in this room today, together. In the spring of 1995, we went to Lhasa. My father would recount that no matter whether in the Potala Palace, in the Barkhor, or in the Jokang, I would always say to the monks and Tibetan pilgrims passing by, "The land of Tibet belongs to the Tibetans. Pukidakpo Pumire." My father and I took many trips together, visiting Dharamsala again, and to Beijing for the first time in 2012. Ose introduced us to Li Jun, with whom my father became fast friends. With Li Jun at the wheel, we took an extended road trip through Inner Mongolia, Lanzhou, and Xining. We stopped in Rebkong and met the family of Gedun Rapsel, one of my father's closest friends. They were unbelievably warm and welcoming. This trip was the first my father and I had taken together in my adulthood. We were companion in cohorts. Some of the most treasured memories I have of him are from this trip. In his work, Elliot has been a judicious voice in increasingly less discerning times. He has censured, including during appearances in China, the Chinese government's oppressive policies in Tibet. He has rejected the view of Tibet as an unspoiled bastion of pure spirituality, and he never had much patience for scholars who easily became groupies of academic fashions. In the afternoon of July 5, 2014, Elliot arrived at Beijing International Airport after a 14-hour flight. Upon arrival, he was refused entry into China and was taken by Chinese policemen to an interrogation room. For an hour and a half, he had his mugshot taken, was interrogated, and prohibited from using his cell phone. He was even followed to the bathroom. When Ose saw him the next day on Skype, he was already back home in New York. She says it was like a dream to her, as if he had never traveled. Elliot was humorous, as usual. He sent her a photo of the voided visa with a bold cross and said, "Congratulations to Mr. Elliot Sperling, receiving the 2014 China's Communist Party Human Rights Award for Foreigners." This voided visa was a badge of honor. It became part of his identity and shaped the last chapter of his life, his queen's lifetime. As the New York Times reported on July 8th, China denies entry to an American scholar who spoke up for a Uyghur colleague. He told the New York Times, "I have no intention of conforming to authoritarian norms for the sake of a visa." My father was incredibly well respected. He possessed this ability to garner and keep the attention of a crowd and to convey the severity and complexity of those causes for which he was so passionate. But as easily as he would convey profound ideas, he would bring light to a room with his quick wit and sharp sense of humor, one of his most compelling traits. In 2014, Ilham Tohti, a Uyghur professor of economics at Minzu University in Beijing, was to spend a year at Indiana University at the university's invitation. He was detained in the Beijing airport just prior to boarding his flight to Indianapolis on charges of separatism. While Ilham was detained, Jauhar, his daughter, boarded the flight alone, bound for the US. Upon her arrival in Indianapolis, Elliot took Jauhar under his wing and oversaw her well-being and education. In Jauhar's own words, Elliot was like an uncle to her. Elliot's friendship with Ilham Tohti and Jauhar best exemplified the compassion and generosity with which he treated everyone. Sure, he made his mark in this world as a scholar, but his monumental intellect was matched by his unbound kindness as a teacher and devotion as a friend. He was a genuinely altruistic human being who dedicated his life to helping others. Elliot continued to mentor and look out for Jauhar, taking her to accept the 2014 Penn Writer Award and the Martin Ennals Award for Human Rights Defenders on behalf of her father. On February 23, 2015, the Dharamsala-based Amnyamachan Institute held a new book release, Trails of the Tibetan Tradition, Papers for Elliot Sperling. The book is a collection of 31 essays from different Tibetologists and writers to pay homage to Elliot. It's in 3 languages, 5 essays in Tibetan, 25 essays in English, and 1 essay in Chinese. Elliot did not know about this 2-year-long book project until then. The book serves as a gift of respect, of profound friendship, and most importantly, witnesses him as a very precious and unique person, a wise, benevolent, and brave individual, and a loyal friend. Though he continuously visited and traveled, it was only in 2015, following his retirement from Indiana University, that Elliot returned from which he came, New York, to establish his final and permanent home, one which could have easily passed for a full-fledged library to anyone who didn't know him. Many felt blessed and honored that he'd chosen to make his home in Jackson Heights, the second capital of the exiled Tibetan world. They were thrilled to see him at demonstrations at the Chinese consulate, art openings at Tibet House, poetry nights at Little Tibet Restaurant, and at dinner parties. Each time, he held court as the intellectual life of the party. He was bombarded with endless questions on topics ranging from art to politics to linguistics, for his erudition was not limited to history alone. Unfailingly generous and eloquent, he happily supplied the intriguing, insightful, and exhaustive answers to each question. Every conversation with him was essentially a seminar. In the small circle of Tibetan activists and artists living in Queens, Elliot quickly fell into a second sort of professorship, a tenure without the trappings of university. My father took great pride in his involvement, not only with the Tibetan and Uyghur communities, but with the broader Jackson Heights, Queens, and Jewish communities. Elliot did anything but retire. He continued to pursue his causes and invest in his community with what appeared to be a newly rekindled passion and idealism. He loved it here. It finally felt like home. Many of you knew my father after he had once again taken on this New York life. Some of you knew him from Indiana, and others from the days in McLeod Ganj. All of you here knew or knew of Elliot at some point on his journey. And while each of your experiences is different and unique, it is clear that the impact he had in New York, across the world, and to the causes for which he tirelessly fought cannot be understated. And your contributions to his life and pursuits will not be forgotten. Thank you.
A little less hope and much much, much less gold. Our pain is wrapped within the tears we cry. We don't really want to say goodbye. Sometime in the future, we'll be your very special child. That's why this song